big majority works just as well.
Yeah, and actually, sorry. Hey, I'm recording a podcast. Everything okay? Amazing. Oh, okay. So I actually am on a podcast. Literally, Jack thought it was an emergency, so he stopped me. So I'm going to hang up, but that is really great.
All good?
Yeah,
Sounds good.
Just calling to tell me that baby massage was a massive success and that Margot was awake for 3 hours and is now into an hour 15 minute nap.
There's an actual like baby masseuse, or
Guys,
is
this is let's fine. We can talk about this very briefly. Getting a spot on one of those classes, life and death.
why isn't this talked about in the campaign?
Yeah, tell you what, the NHS waiting list, the baby massage waiting list, that's the big issue. Hello and welcome to another episode of Bite the Ballot, TLDR's UK election podcast. I'm Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined today by Ben Blissett.
Hello.
And Rory Taylor.
Hello.
So before we get into the whole podcast shenanigans, I'm just going to, as I have done for the last couple of podcasts, just plug our magazine, which is called Too Long. As I mentioned in the last couple of podcasts, we are genuinely really proud of it, and we do genuinely think it's a really great product. And I think the main reason is that we get to go into a bit more depth on various topics, and also it is going to be more constructive than our normal videos. Again, I mentioned this last time, but we always focus on like crises and things going wrong and why the world is falling apart. And this is going to be a bit more positive and a bit more focused on like why, how Labour might be able to fix things, whether or not that's possible, what might happen going forwards. But in this one, I also want to stress that we have, as part of our sort of like premium package, so anyone who buys the premium version, you'll be able to watch our sort of special election live stream, which will be happening on Thursday evening.
Yes.
And that's where definitely Ben, probably Rory, maybe me, depends on whether or not my relatively newborn child is like cooperating, will be talking through the election results as they happen. You'll be able to interact with us and send us abusive messages and heckle Ben's bad takes. You'll be able to do whatever you want on the live stream. The other thing I'd say, and this is not a binding commitment, but I think this is the sort of thing where we would hope to do something similar going forward. So if you are like a premium member, you're a premium subscriber, whatever it's going to be, we do hope to sort of gradually introduce some more like interactive things, events in the future, because it's just one of those, it feels like a sort of the right thing to do to sort of nurture a bit of a relationship with the core audience. But then also we want to get some feedback on the magazine, and we're going to do that via premium subscribers. So, we're going to get the first one out, and if there's stuff that you like about it, stuff that you don't like about it, stuff you want to change, want to include, want to exclude, we'll be asking for your input going forward. So yeah, again, please, if you feel like it, invest in your education, buy a magazine. Why not? Anyway, with that massive plug all done, let's get into the main bit of the podcast. We're going to start with our favourite campaign moment. So, Rory, what's your favourite campaign moment?
Shall I take Ed Davey for this one?
For it. Go on, why not?
You could have a weekly one just with Ed Davey stunts, but today, day of recording, he bungee jumped off a crane, and his whole thing this time was, I'm about to do something I've never done before, bungee jump. You should do the same and vote Lib Dem. So he's trying to make it seem like take the leap of faith. And yeah, I mean, he did it to be fair to him. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I was saying to Ben earlier, because this is obviously the last week of the campaign, but there's still a few days to go. I don't know if the bungee jump is their plan for the bit that was their big finale, or if they've got one more thing. The only thing we can think of is skydiving, I think. But we'll see.
That would be Gartner, just all the way
up in an orbit, big weather balloon up to the stratosphere. Or something.
That would be impressive, though.
Yeah.
Ben, do you have a campaign moment you want to talk about?
I mean, nothing as whimsical as that. I mean, there's other sort of smaller ones. I think the only other sort of like fun / interesting one was led by Donkey's campaign last week that got, presumably they set this up before Farage started speaking in this venue. They had a sort of screen slowly lower while Farage was talking.
I think this might be mine as well.
And it has... I Heart Nigel at the bottom, and as it's slowly descending, you can sort of see a face emerge, and it's Putin's face. So it's sort of a protest against Farage as he's talking.
People should go watch that. Yeah, they should. Very entertaining.
And it's very good because the Farage's sort of campaigners tried to pull it down afterwards, and they just sort of really struggled to get it down. It's just really...
It was quite a sweet reminder of how sort of like amateur British politics is. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like it's town halls and... bad PowerPoints, and it's not American.
Well, just to add to that as well, another campaign moment last week was there's already been a couple of videos of David Cameron campaigning on like Ring doorbells. I think this is the new sort of innovation in campaigning now, is that we're getting videos from Ring doorbells of politicians ringing on them not being in them, like recording a message to the homeowner. And we've had another former prime minister this week been caught on one of these, which was Theresa May.
Yeah.
And she sort of rung a doorbell and they weren't in. She just recorded a message. And it's obviously been all over Twitter of like, this is just a very British way of campaigning, isn't it? We've got former prime ministers walking around very sort of leafy suburban towns, asking people to vote for the candidate and putting a little leaflet through the letterbox. I mean, you wouldn't see that with like Obama in America, would you? Sort of going up to a Ring doorbell and putting a little leaflet through saying, vote for your local senator.
And you endlessly see them getting like heckled in the street or on tubes or stuff like that. I mean, Georgina, one of our writers, bumped into Jeremy Corbyn in just in the middle of the street this week. Again, it's very British. It's very provincial. It's really quite nice. I mean, it does make you feel a sort of sense of political affinities to the British system, no? Do you know what I mean?
Unless
like,
you're having milkshakes thrown on you, in which case it's not as nice. But yes.
You did take that very well, though. That's a Nigel Farage reference. But
yes,
you did take that very well. And also, I like that it's milkshakes instead of guns. You know what I mean? Okay, so the main story, it's hard to talk about anything else, but the main story is just going to be quite a general, basically, could we be surprised at this point in the campaign? Is a Labour supermajority, or at least big majority, whatever supermajority means, is a Labour majority inevitable at this point?
I love how you already corrected yourself on supermajority.
I don't hate the phrase supermajority. I mean, I know it has like no sort of formal definition in the British context, but I think it does capture quite nicely the sort of unprecedented nature of the size of the majority. And I think maybe we're now not going to talk about the thing I just said we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the supermajority thing. But
Sorry, I've railroaded.
But the supermajority thing I think is interesting because I think actually people always say, oh, it makes no difference. If you have a majority, you have a majority.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think that it feels like that in the current context because Labour currently feels like a very well unified, well-oiled machine with little infighting. They're in campaign mode. When Labour get into government, there will be big differences, interparliamentary differences between the more left-leaning parts of the party and the more right-leaning parts of the party about how to fix the UK's problem. I think especially on tax and spend. I mean, that's going to hit the ground running immediately. They're going to get in there and Starmer's going to say a whole lot of restrictive stuff about not raising taxes here, not raising taxes there, not national income, not national insurance, not income tax, not VAT, not corporation tax. And, the first crisis that hits, the first time someone goes like, oh, waiting lists are going up, a large contingent of the Labour Parliamentary Party is going to be like, well, let's raise income tax, let's fund the NHS. And if he has, the difference there between, let's say, a 50-seat majority, I'd say that there's a formal faction in the Labour Party, which is like the left-leaning faction. It's called something.
Socialist Campaign Group, I think.
Exactly, that's it. Yeah, there's like 30-something MPs in that. Am I right in saying that? Maybe.
Yeah, although I don't actually know what it will be after this election, given the various purges, and then the incoming MPs probably won't be.
But whatever it is, you've got to take that and then you add on, you're probably the left-leaning MPs. There's meaningfully probably about 50 MPs that will, well, you don't actually know the precise number. My point is that there will be differences within the Labour Party, and the larger the majority, the more of a free hand Keir Starmer has. And so I do think it makes a difference whether you're a 50-seat majority or 200-seat majority.
I don't think I disagree with you substantively. I think it's just the point that a supermajority has a very specific definition in the American context of it being, a two-thirds majority and the sort of constitutional significance of that, whereas that just doesn't hold the same weight here.
Yeah, that's
so I just think
point.
Big majority works just as well.
Yeah, and actually, I think you're basically right. And the other thing is I agree that we should resist American cultural hegemony in all cases.
100%.
So let's just stop saying supermajority.
That was all I was going to pick you up on. So we're all good. We're all good.
Okay, yeah. So let's move on to what I said we'd talk about, which is, do we think the result is now inevitable? We are now recording this on Monday. We are 3 days away from voting day. Postal voting obviously opened a couple of days ago.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who've voted already with their postal vote. Yeah.
So do you think this means the result is inevitable? The polls are pretty clear.
I think it's inevitable that Labour are going to win not a supermajority, a big majority. But I think the question now, there's two really. The first is whether the media reporting that Labour are almost certainly going to win a big majority will prevent people going out and voting. And this is a thing that Labour have been worried about for a few weeks. That the more news you get that it's inevitable that Labour is going to win, the more that encourages people to just stay home. What's the point in voting for them? Or even voting maybe Green, Lib Dem, something like that in protest to try, against certain things that Labour stands for, i.e. Gaza. So that's one question. The other question is exactly what's going to happen to the Tories and how many seats they're going to get. They're almost certainly going to be reduced massively, but there's quite a significant difference between them getting, say, 140 seats or sub 100. And I think that's where that's still to be decided where that's going to lie. And I think that is very contingent on the first part, whether people, just stay at home because Labour's secured such a massive majority. And if they get 140 seats, inevitably the conclusion that's going to be drawn on Friday is this was a bad night for the Tories. This is going to be a really bad 5 years, but the party's still alive. It can come back. This isn't game over for the Conservatives. If we get down to below 100 seats, then we really are talking about like doomsday scenarios for the Tories. Then alarm bells really start ringing.
One of the things I was just going to say is that you were saying that there's this worry in Labour camp that all these super optimistic polls about the big majority, not quite super, but big majority they're getting for, will inspire sort of apathy in potential Labour voters. But don't you think that's also sort of cuts the other way in that, like, if everyone thinks the outcome is predetermined, you might go out to vote if you're a Reform or a Green voter because they're sort of like almost protest vote. That's like sort of you want a middle finger up to the system sort of thing. But if you're a Tory voter and they're losing, you might just be like, I can't be bothered really. Can't be able to take out my photo ID and go vote. I'm just going to stay at home.
It's definitely, well, this is it. I mean, that is a very valid argument. I have seen articles suggesting that there is also the argument that people just don't like voting for losing parties, right? So it might actually cut the other way in the sense of the massive Labour majority actually encourages more people to vote Labour because
they want to be a part. They want to be
part of the winning party. So, but I don't really know. I have nothing really to back this up other than instinct.
Yeah.
But my instinct is that it will encourage people. It will encourage apathy rather than encourage people to go out and vote. Again, I don't have any data to back that up. It is just an instinct. But I just get this sense that there is still some sort of resistance to voting Labour on certain grounds among certain people, like on Gaza, and the fact that they're predicted to get such a large majority will only encourage them to either stay at home or vote for a different party in those sort of people.
Rory, what are you thinking?
I don't think that we're gonna. So your question was, are we going to see any surprises and can things be turned around this week?
Yeah.
I don't think anything will happen this week that is going to change the polls, but I think the only room for a surprise is if the polls as they are correct, effectively.
I think I agree. It's weird, isn't it? That there's this sort of assumption, I think, in most political discourse that actually the polls must be overstating it.
Yeah.
Because Tories can't actually lose.
I think
that badly.
But I think, so when I say there is potential for surprise, like for me, that would be, the Tories have still lost massively, but have done surprisingly well relative to how badly it could have gone. I think for a lot of people who've been looking at these many MRP polls, which have shown the Tories, sub 100, maybe being overtaken by the Lib Dems, if they get something like 110, 120 seats, still a massive loss, that it actually looks a lot better based on the sort of things we've been seeing beforehand. So I guess in the sense that will be a surprise, but I don't expect there to be a surprise beyond that.
I do think that is I think that is the biggest question really, and I think that's the framing that is the big change on Friday, is whether the Tories get sort of sub 100, maybe sub 110, 120 or over that.
Yeah.
I think that changes the discourse entirely. I think that is what we're
so 100 you think is sort of like, I think I agree with you, it's like the psychologically important number. Going under 100 is just wild. I mean, it's sort of just catastrophic, isn't it?
And if the Lib Dems are predicted to get 50, 60, 70, depending on like which polls you look at, like you win touching distance. Like I don't think there are the odd poll that put the Lib Dems above the Tories, but they're fleeting. I don't think, unless it really properly is disastrous.
So what I've seen a couple of polling aggregators give different results, and what a lot of it seems to depend on is the amount of tactical voting you assume between Labour and the Lib Dems. My instinct is actually it'll be a lot higher than people think, because I think basically the trend over time has been the last few elections, the anti-Tory vote has become increasingly good at sort of coordinating.
Especially in by-elections.
Yeah. And we saw this piece in the FT about where Labour and the Lib Dems are sending their campaigners. And they're so clearly sending campaigners to basically the ones sending campaigners away from places where they could split the anti-Tory vote. And so my instinct is that it will get a lot worse. And I think what's interesting is this one of those where Labour and Lib Dem voters have been learning to tactically vote for the past few elections. The Tories have always had a monopoly on the right-wing vote, really. I mean, save caveats about UKIP or whatever. And I think this is going to be one of these cases where, the left has learned to tactical vote. The right just hasn't. And this is one of the reasons why the reform Tory vote is so chaotic in the way it interacts with each other, is that they haven't had that practice. They don't know how it works. You don't know which constituencies are sort of Reform, Tory toss-ups or whatever. And I don't think you'll see much tactical voting, which means I do think that the Reform Tory vote will be split quite aggressively, which I think could make things even worse for Tories. I mean, I am probably thinking that below 100 seats now is quite likely.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's difficult as well because I'm sort of psychologically in the same mindset that you were discussing earlier. It was like, or maybe you were discussing it. It was the sort of, it just can't be this bad.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like, as much as the polls are saying this, I just can't get past this barrier of it, they just can't go below 100. But you're right. Like, all of the things do point to that being a distinct possibility, but I just can't quite get myself to believe that.
As a sort of commentariat, we haven't thought enough about the consequences of that.
Yes.
You know what? I mean, now I'm going to, having said we haven't thought about it. Ben, what are the consequences of this? If the Tories get below 100 seats, what follows?
I've thought about this in the sense of like, I've written videos about it, but I've not thought about it in the sense of it actually being genuinely a possibility.
Considered it as real. Yeah.
So the consequences of that are enormous in terms of the how momentous that would be in the moment. It would be sort of the potential beginning of the decline of the Conservative Party as we know it. If they get below 100 seats, you're in touching distance of the Lib Dems. If the Lib Dems at any point, whether that's in the next election or even in this one, overtake the Conservatives, that means you get fewer votes, you get fewer seats, you get less attention from the media because you're just not speaking in Parliament as much. You're not as relevant as a political party. That makes it even harder to acquire funding from, people who, massive party donors, which means that you have less campaigns to spend on, you get less media focus. It's just so hard to then come back from that. It's so hard then to like get votes back. And not only that, but you've got the additional challenge of, as we were discussing earlier, people don't like to ally themselves with losing parties. They just don't. So you've got all of that. Everything is working against you.
They don't like incumbents either.
No.
So, I mean, that's the Labour will come into power, but they'll probably, let's not assume too much, but they might quite quickly find themselves relatively unpopular. And then, there has to be an opposition party. Do you see what I mean? I take all those, go on, Rory.
I think the question there is, initially, at least in this Parliament, if Labour does quickly become unpopular, who is the number one opposition that's, what angle is the opposition coming from? If it's the Lib Dems, that pushes Labour in a very specific direction. If it's still the Conservatives, then that obviously pushes them sort of in the other direction.
What do you mean? Flesh that out a little bit.
So if the Lib Dems are the official opposition and Labour are sort of becoming more unpopular, you've got the Lib Dems, effectively trying to pressure Labour into being more socially progressive, possibly more like tax and spend, although I know Lib Dems aren't massive on that, unlike like the Greens are, for example.
They're big on spending, Lib Dems at the moment. Not really.
Whereas if it's the Conservatives as the main opposition, or as the official opposition, it's the same dynamic that we've got now, which is just sort of left v right.
But this is one of the reasons that I'm sceptical of a Lib Dem opposition actually working in practice. Is that you're right? The policy differences would be different to the Tories. The Lib Dems would be pushing basically when if there's fiscal stress, the Tories are probably pushing for spending cuts and keeping taxes low as they can be, while the Lib Dems were probably pushing for more taxing to meet that spending, basically. So sort of fiscally to the left. And you're right that on social issues, they'd be very, very different. It's hard to pin the Lib Dems, sort of put them on that spectrum on social issues because there's quite a range. But the Tories are so clearly on the right of it to Labour's, while Labour's way to the left of the Tories, that's like an obvious battleground. But I just don't think that really works then as an opposition because they're fighting over quite narrow territory. You can't, there's only so much sort of like ideological wiggle room for both those parties. And even if sort of like to sort of become the opposition, the Lib Dems move to the right, you can imagine to try to differentiate themselves sufficiently from Labour and Labour reactively sort of move a bit to the left, they're still occupying quite a narrow space in the political spectrum. And I think that there will just be a large bit of the electorate that's just like, well, neither of these reflect my politics.
And I think I instinctively agree with you. And I think if the Lib Dems were to become the opposition after this election, I don't think that would last beyond one parliament.
No, you need a right wing. In the first part of the vote system, you just do need it lends itself to two parties, and you have to have
That then leads because everything I said previously is in sort of the Tory decline I stand by. But the thing that I was going to add on to the end is that then we get onto the question of reform and how the Tories interact with reform. Because you're right, you do need like a right wing opposition bloc to balance out the left. There is right wing contingent in this country that there needs to be something to represent that. And I think the question then is, do reform and the Tories come to some kind of merger like in Canada, or do senior Reform figures move into the Conservative Party and just turn the Conservatives into Reform? So I think if the Tories do get sub 100 seats, then it's quite evident that that is at least partially because of Reform, and that they can't sort of. I feel like the instinct that they'll have, especially immediately after the election, is we can't fight Reform. We've got to do something to balance them out or to mitigate that. And I think that if the next Tory leadership ends up being right wing, as I suspect it probably will be, then it will probably be invite Farage in, especially because he'll win his Clacton seat.
But do you not think, I mean, this is sort of two separate questions, but do you not think the dynamic that me and Roy just described there, where there is going to be political demand for a right-wing party, and the way that first past the post works means that there sort of has to be one right-wing party. I mean, the way first past the post works is if you want to maximise electoral outcome, maximise your seats, you need to coalesce around one party on both sides. Don't you think that sort of like structurally advantages the Tories in the long term? That's why I think a Tory Reform merger isn't actually that likely unless they do appallingly badly. I mean, the Canada example, they win like 2 seats, don't they? Win something appalling.
They literally were left with next to nothing.
And this is not the same thing. No, and so
I agree, but this is what I'm saying is that I think that that is a possibility. I don't think it's I think the most likely thing is that you invite Farage in and he sort of restructures the party from within. But I just think that the alternative to this, especially immediately after the election, is that if they don't get on top of it immediately, then Reform continues to be a problem for the next 5 years in by-elections and other smaller elections, and that this question of what do we do about Reform just will continually reoccur in the media cycle.
I think the issue here, and I think the sort of apparent disagreement here, is that I don't really think that Reform can survive that unless they do amazingly well a parliamentary term, because they're making their hay out of the fact that they are the right-wing opposition to a right-wing government. There's a lot of more right-wing opposition to a right-wing government. But once Labour in power, the demand is just for a right-wing opposition. And I think that voters will naturally realise that you can either have one of Tories or Reform, and I think they will just sort of coalesce towards the Tories, especially given that one of the issues for the Tories is you've been in power for so long, and it means that even if you are ideologically aligned with Reform on lots of issues, which I think they sort of are, you listen to the rhetoric coming out of the Tory party. Sunak says he wants to be low taxes. Sunak he wants to cut immigration, all that sort of thing. It's just they haven't done it. But once they're in opposition, that's less of an issue, and they'll be attacking Labour on the same lines and promising the same things. The part of the thing is that the Reform can just promise more.
I just think that I think what tends to happen when you have a party that's been in it a long time and that they're quickly ousted, especially if it's by quite a landslide, is they get quite desperate and they get quite panicked. So they don't know what to do to achieve power again. And what I think could happen, I agree that the electorate probably will just search for a right-wing party and will land on the Conservatives. Like that is historically who they would vote for. The issue is if in by-elections and things they do particularly badly, then the question will keep coming up, why are we doing this? But could we be doing better? And if Farage is in the Commons and he's quite a good orator, whatever you think of him, he is a good orator.
Farage will be in the Commons,
and he'll be in the Commons in his Clacton seat. It will always keep coming back to him as like, what do we do? Like if we bring him on side, all these bad by-election showings or whatever it is over the next 5 years could be boosted if we just bring him on side. And that is only bolstered by the fact that if it's a right-wing Tory that takes over the Conservatives, if it's Kemi Badenoch, someone like that, then I think that the question of what to do about Farage will inevitably, the answer will be bring him in. And in fact, we've already seen that as an answer.
I think Suella Braverman has said that.
Yes.
Kemi Badenoch would not bring in Nigel Farage. I don't think. Kemi Badenoch, I think, would be very confident about squeezing out Nigel Farage. Kemi Badenoch, she plays on the issues that motivate Reform Tory marginal voters.
Yeah.
Kemi Badenoch is very effective. On cultural war issues, she can do the Farage thing in the same way that sort of Boris Johnson could out Farage on those sort of like very salient issues.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think that it's substantively I agree that she's as right wing, but like she's not the same orator as Nigel. But she's not got the same.
Oh, I think Kemi Badenoch is very articulate. Yeah, I think she's a good, good performer.
I think she's better than some of the other candidates, but I don't think she'd rival Farage in that respect. Certainly not when he's in the Commons and making these inevitably quite backbench speeches all this, and when campaigning in by-elections.
He'll be quite backbench. Yeah, he'll
be very backbench. Yeah. But I don't know. I still think there is a world in which the Conservatives consider bringing him on side, and I think that is the answer.
I think the main barrier to that is that Nigel Farage will want to absorb the Tories, whereas the Tories will want to absorb Nigel Farage and Reform, and they'll each want to be the sort of dominant player in that dynamic. And I can't see a way that Nigel Farage would ever sort of merge with the Tories in a way that he is not the sort of the top dog in that deal.
I think we probably all agree. So I think we disagree on what the bad outcome would look like. But I think presumably, Roy, you agree here that like that a lot then depends on the leadership election.
Yeah.
Because if it's Suella Braverman, she sort of signalled that she would essentially co-lead
Yeah.
a reform Conservative Party. But I can't imagine anyone else agreeing to that.
Yeah, because I think if you're any other Tory and then you end up taking over, you know that it's going to take a long time. But I don't think I think they would look at the next 10, 15 years and think, we can recover. We've done it before. I know from a slightly higher baseline, but I think most Tories who will be left in the Tory party after the election do think that they can recover, even if it will take a long time. And I think instantly going for Nigel Farage wouldn't be something that a lot of them would do.
I think it depends how panicked they look and how panicked it feels afterwards. And if it is sub 100, I think that panic will set in.
But I think the panic cuts both ways, because the panic would also make you very defensive. If you're a new leader and you're looking at, oh God, I'm doing really badly, you'd be very panicked not to immediately give up your new leadership to Nigel Farage.
I'm not saying that I think it's going to happen within the first week. I just think that there is a world in which Farage gets elected and either defects to the Tories and reform. I think that is the most, that he defects, becomes a Conservative, either runs for leadership, usurps. Like we've seen in the last few years that the Conservatives are quite quick to overturn leaders if they're not doing well. And I think that if Farage was to join, and we have a significant right-wing contingent on the, in Parliament for the Conservatives, I think that there is a world in which they relatively quickly turn to Farage as the answer.
I'm not convinced.
No,
I don't think
you had a thought, but
Sorry.
you didn't quite finish. Ben very rudely.
Apologies, Rory.
You were basically saying you weren't convinced. You didn't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think there may be a merger one day in some form, but I just don't think it's going to be anytime soon, really. Because I think Nigel Farage, if this election isn't the election which Nigel Farage can sort of kill off the Tories, it's sort of it's a longer term project. This is sort of step one. And I think it would be a very knee-jerk reaction for any new Tory leader to instantly go to him. Especially as yes, the votes for reform have massively undercut the Tories, but in terms of the electoral map, reform aren't actually a threat in terms of seats. They're not going to overtake the Conservatives in seat number, and that gives the Conservatives a massive upper hand over reform. And I think they know that, which was probably stop them going cap in hand to Nigel Farage.
And I think that's becomes especially apparent once the election's over. At the moment, we're looking at the poll numbers, been like reform on 18%. Wow, crazy! And then you get to Parliament, and
he's got one or two seats, and you think, well, actually, it's not.
Yeah, it's just an angry Nige. I was going to say, so two things. One is, very interestingly, is that I don't know, consciously or not, but you said 10 or 15 years. The implication being that you think the Tories will be out of power, Labour presumably in power, for at least the next 2 terms.
He's got you there, Rory.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, so I think it's interesting.
I basically based that on the last, New Labour and then the Thatcher major years. If we're assuming there is a natural cycle, then I was just, those are the numbers I was going off. But
no, I get that. I think that's interesting because I think Starmer thinks in those terms as well.
Yeah.
He's a decade of rejuvenation, whatever he calls it. And I think a lot of people do think of those terms. I think for the reason you just mentioned, which is that we're used to sort of 13 years of New Labour, and then we're going to go for 40 years of the Tories. Why not another, similar amount for this one? But there's a couple of things. I mean, one, it's very different political times. Those are two-party times. It's not like the moment we could be in our first 5-party election here. And then the other thing is that it's incongruous with the European experience. And what you've seen in, let's just say, the last couple of years is that European politics, which in many countries was dominated by a sort of like Christian Democrat centre-right and a social democrat centre-left, has massively fractured in basically every big European country. I mean, we're looking at the French presidential elections right now, for legislative elections, legislative, not parliamentary.
Very different.
But the most triangulaires ever for runoffs, a couple of 4-way runoffs, the vote unimaginably split. I mean, France is a great example because it only sort of like settles into a 2-party system in the 80s or whatever. But Germany, better example, just impossibly split. If you include Sarah Wagener, it's like 6 parties over the 5% threshold.
I think the main,
but also my point is not only fragmented, is that there are shorter terms. In that sort of incumbency fatigue is more aggressive. Germany, another good example. That coalition has been in for a couple of years and is already stupendously unpopular and will not survive the election.
And to be fair, that came off the back of a very long CDU-led government, which I think came off the back of a fairly long
SPD government. Gerhard Schröder. And Gerhard Schröder nearly survived. I think it's the in 7 or 9. But yeah, so that was a long stint in power as well.
I think that, I that could happen here. But
Massive question.
I think our electoral system sort of defends, if you want to, not necessarily a positive thing, defends us against that type of fragmentation. But also, we, as a country, we sort of say, we've avoided this far right surge that other European countries have had. But I think part of the reason we've avoided that is because our centre-right party has massively shifted to the right. And I don't think that's something that should go sort of overlooked.
I also think there's a sense in which,
I
think a lot of it's anti-establishment vibes.
Yeah.
I think Brexit was sort of our outlet for that.
Yeah.
I think it sort of exhausted some of the anti-establishment sentiment in the country because it happened and it wasn't great.
Yeah, and now we've got possibly a incoming massive majority, possibly stable government at a time when lots of European countries are sort of going through the opposite experience.
Yeah,
which is an interesting.
I do think it's interesting. I think that. So you mentioned there, I guess there were idiosyncrasies to the British experience. The Tories moving right, first past the post. But I do think that there is just this sense that actually, antipathy towards incumbents is more. It happens faster these days than it used to. That does seem to be the case across Europe. There are countries that have bucked that trend. I mean, everyone's favorite example is Pedro Sanchez, and it looks like Spanish politics has somehow fragmented and then sort of come back together in a way. But in general, it's probably fair to say that most European, the sort of aggregate European experience is a fragmentation and a sort of just less patience for incumbents. And I do think it's a really open question about what happens in 2029. I mean, I know it's almost redundant to look forward that far in the future, but I think there's a sense that because they're going to end up with a massive majority, of course, they'll at least win in 2029. But I'm just not really sure that's true. I think this is such a wildly volatile election. The other thing is that, sure, they have a massive seat majority, but Labour will have won, the polls are correct, plausibly on a lower share of the vote than Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, and when you have such...
And then translates to 75% of seats.
When you have such an efficient vote share, sort of vote to seat setup, you can lose that really, really easily. You just need to lose a few people in the right places, and someone else to pick
up a few people in the right places, and then all of a sudden you're in completely different territory. Yeah, so I think there's so much to talk about. But that takes us on to one of the other interesting things, which is that it's very efficient vote to seat distribution. Do you think that there's a sort of, how worried are you about the sort of anti-democratic element of this election? Because we all seem to be quite happy about the Tories getting out of power, but that's covered up the fact that we're going to be giving an enormous majority to a party that commands less than 40% of the popular vote. This is the first, it's going to be the biggest majority in history. Am I right in saying, if it's on track? Yeah, probably.
It's a post-war, definitely.
Sure, post-war, biggest on, frankly, it is a Jeremy Corbyn 2017 fraction of the vote. I mean, that's just fundamentally, it's the least representative outcome, I do think, in electoral history. The other election that people always point to is the Blair... Is it 05? It's 05 after Iraq, when the Lib Dems split the vote a little bit and he wins a majority on 35%.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
And this is going to be not just a majority, but a super majority.
Big majority.
A big majority on 38% maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I look at those numbers and I just feel like a bit squeamish. I'm just
I agree. I mean, I favour some form of proportional representation, and it is a sort of uncomfortable reality of this election. But I can't. I think we actually discussed it possibly tangentially last week on the podcast. But I can't see. I think the result will sort of rekindle those discussions about proportional representation. But I can't see it actually going anywhere.
I think I've got two things on this. The first is that you've sort of discussed this already, but if you compare to Europe, the fact that at this moment, with cost of living and everything, you've got multiple parties sort of trying to form a government together, which can lead to often some sort of chaotic decision making when you're in. That is the argument sort of for that. I understand the sort of reticence and sort of hesitation for a party to get such a small vote share. That translates into, as you say, 75% of seats. The argument for that is that it leads to just a stronger government. And previously, that is the argument for first past the post. That argument hasn't really held in the last 10 years because we've had such small majorities. So the way you can sort of flip that on its head and say that this is the first time that first past the post is actually working as intended, which is
That's a
giving
very good point, I
which is
think,
which is
actually.
giving a party sort of a majority,
I
a
never
strong
say that
majority.
about your points as well.
Well, there you
Really
go.
is a very good point.
There's-
Because you're right to point to the European experiences that I think we often sort of like, the grass is always greener. We always be like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have European-style coalitions
Yeah.
and everyone gets on nicely? And it turns out the
Geert
Europeans don't
Wilders.
all get on
Yeah.
nicely.
Yeah, but and then the other thing is that I put relatively good odds on some right-wing columnist in the Telegraph on Friday U-turning on all of their previous opinions and saying that they want proportional
I
representation.
think they've already started doing it.
Have
They've
they?
well,
Oh, of
yeah,
course they
not
have,
openly
yeah.
saying we need PR, but they've been saying, this is first past the post is clearly failing. It's not a system designed to give
they've
Starmer
never said that
dictatorship.
before, and I bet that same
yeah.
person said in the 2011 AV referendum how
Yeah.
fantastic first
Don't
past
you think
post
it's
was.
interesting? Because the obstacle to first past post has always been the fact that the right has never experienced its disadvantages. And now at least it's
Yeah.
true that the right will have experienced
And the
disadvantages.
first week that they've experienced it,
Yeah.
they've all U-turned on their opinions.
But this is
Yes.
the point, is the point we're making before is that they have no experience tactical rating because they've never experienced the disadvantages of first past the
Yeah.
post. And so this is going to be the first time, and it's going to be both Tory and Reform voters because they're both going to be looking at it and be like, millions of us turn out to vote Tory or Reform. And
Yeah.
we've got a handful of
Yeah,
seats.
there'll be a discussion for like 2 or 3 weeks after the election. Everyone will forget about it, and Labour won't obviously change it because they've just won 75% of seats on 38% of votes.
This is true, but I can
this
imagine-
always happens.
This is true, but there is definitely a contingent within the Labour Party that is informed by the historic experience is in favour of electoral reform.
Yeah, but they're not empowering the Labour Party.
No, true, but it just means that for the first time you will have a party in power where at least some fraction of the parliamentary base does believe in electoral reform. You'll have an opposition, the Lib Dems especially, obviously, that's quite aggressively, part of it, the Lib Dem part of it, quite aggressively in favour of electoral reform. And then you'll have a sort of resentful Tory reform opposition that now has, for convenience, decided that they like electoral reform as well.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the largest appetite for electoral reform we've ever had in Parliament.
Yeah, probably, but it still won't make any difference.
I think it could happen in something like 2029. I think it will become an issue, as
Yeah.
it were. And then I think that people will start taking more serious policy positions on it.
Yeah,
But I think you're right. I didn't actually never thought about that, is that the European experience, it does point to the disadvantages of a PR system.
There is sort of an interesting parallel in Italy. So George Meloni wants to get through this constitutional reform that will effectively shake up their electoral system, and it will reward the winning party with at least 55% of the seats in Parliament. And people are saying, we cannot have this because then you might end up with a party winning, the first place party getting like 35% of the vote, and they'll have more than half the seats in Parliament. We can't stand for that.
So
Like, yeah.
yeah. How unpalatable
Yeah.
that would be.
Yeah.
That's a good video, by the way.
Thank you.
You should do that.
I think we did it.
We should do it again. Okay. So I think all in all, we all think that the Labour big majority is pretty much inevitable.
Yeah.
And we think, actually, if anything, that there's this sort of baseline assumption that the polls are sort of wrong. But most people just can't really believe that the polls can actually be correct. And we're not really thought through the consequences, but they're massive. The consequences are massive.
Weeks of content.
We
after the-
could have just done the podcast there, which is just the consequences, massive.
Yeah.
That's it.
And we've managed to do this whole bit so far without making any sort of bad football Gareth Southgate comparisons with Rishi Sunak.
Do you want to get one in?
Oh no, I wouldn't dare.
Oh, I think that's not not the one. Oh, because the last minute
Yeah,
comeback
last
sort of
minute
thing.
comebacks. That's what Rishi Sunak is hoping for. But
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
And now we have done
yes,
it.
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think we're the podcast for
Yeah.
that sort of answer.
I don't think we have the audience for it either.
The next bit of the podcast is going to be minor parties.
Oh,
Minor parties. What?
I was going to say, the whole thing has got mixed up now where minor parties are sort of just as
Yeah, they're just
relevant
part of-
as...
yeah. Let's talk about
yeah.
the Tories.
Yeah. We are going to talk
good.
about,
Yeah.
I think we are going to talk about reform.
Yes. Okay.
Because I think Lib
Second
Dems-
largest party in the UK at the minute.
There you go.
Yeah.
Lib Dems, obviously, Ed Davey's bungee jumping. Yeah, we've got this. He's going to do something massive when the actual election happens. But that's the story. Reform. It's interesting because I think in the past couple of weeks, me and you were talking about this in the office a second ago. But a fair few number of polls have found a slight dip in the reform vote between like 1 to 4 points, basically. And I think that doesn't sound that much, but it's worth keeping in mind that until very, very recently, the reform vote was just going up. And the fact that it hadn't like stagnate and then fall, it just goes up, and now it started falling a little bit. It's quite a steep sort of turnaround. So we think this is for two reasons. I mean, the first is some questionable policy positions that Farage has taken up recently, especially on Ukraine. We talked about it in the office, but basically the sort of reform Tory votes. I think you said they don't want to. They want a Churchill. They don't want a Chamberlain.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and Farage was basically saying the West is to blame and sort of tacitly suggesting that we should be pushing for a ceasefire or some sort of end to the fighting. And then also, I think mostly uncovered by Channel 4, but some questionable comments by campaigners and candidates, or was it just campaigners?
I think in the Channel 4 thing, it was campaigners, but there have been candidates previously who've said all sorts of things.
The biggest one were sort of racist comments made by a campaigner. And obviously it was sort of, this was responded to by Rishi Sunak himself, who I think actually in the campaign, I think his response to this was one of the more powerful things that he's done. I think he came across very well in that, and he spoke about like the fact, how that impacts his children, things like that. Like I think it was a really, irrespective of anything else, like just language like that from a party that is polling as high as Reform are, often campaigners for party polling as high as they are. It's just completely unacceptable. I think Sunak responding to that, I think he came across very well in that. But yeah, I think this has really hurt Reform. This is a thing that Farage has been aware of ever since he, led UKIP, which is that having people who are associated with you making like particularly offensive comments, specifically on things to do with race and xenophobia, things like that, it's really damaging to the party. I think this is part of the reason that we've seen this decline. I mean, it is only, as you pointed out, it's a small decline between like 1 and 4 points.
Well, it's hard to know, isn't it? I mean, all this polling has done the last couple of days. It could be continuing on.
Yes. But I think as well, I think it is also worth pointing out that there probably was always going to be a ceiling to Reform support. And I think we were reaching that ceiling. I think expecting Reform to continue going upwards beyond 22, 23, 24 points, which some pollsters were putting them at. I think
Really?
it was always
24 points?
I think there was one that I saw that put them there.
I think that might have been the Matt Goodwin people polling.
But again, I agree that is only one poll, but even other ones are putting them at sort of in the very
nearly
low 20s.
20, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, 20.
So there was always going to be a ceiling to that, but I think that, as you say, I think we hit that ceiling, and as we're hitting that ceiling, we had these sort of like controversies which has caused them to decline. The question now is whether this decline continues up until polling day, or whether this decline is only temporary and then it stabilises. And as you say, the polls are always on a lag, so we're just probably not going to know. So it's up for debate. I think that I do think we're going to see a little bit more. We're always going to see a bit more of a decline anyway, because there is. It's just a different. I think it's a different question when you get. I think what pollsters ask you is very different to the question that you're answering on polling day. Because you can sort of say, I want to vote Reform, I'm annoyed at the Conservatives, but when you actually get in the voting booth and you think about what the consequences of that will be, especially if you're a right-wing voter, and the fact that you sort of know and you've been told for the last few days that Reform aren't going to win seats, the best they can hope for is maybe 3 or 4. The Conservatives are the sort of like right-wing representatives of the people in this country. I think that there was always going to be a bit of a difference on polling day to what polls were going to suggest. And I think that all of this is probably coming together in a sort of negative way for Reform.
Yeah.
Hitting the ceiling, negative campaigning, and the question voters are answering in the polling booth just being different to what pollsters are asking.
There's a chronic risk, isn't it, for Farage, in that he's trying to sort of like, he's starting off with the furthest right of British politics, and as in not where he is, but as in like that's the beginning of his base.
Yeah.
And he's trying to expand it into the sort of like that 25% quartile that you're describing. He's trying to sort of widen it out. And there's the chronic risk is that that 5% are the most passionate and the loudest, the sort of most right-wing 5%, the BNP 5. The BNP 5 is a great hit band, but they end up being your activists and your campaigners, and they end up sort of, at least in the media, because they get more exposure, representing your party, and that just turns off that remaining 15-20%.
And I know we've sort of said Farage is quite an effective orator at times, but I think his response to these various scandals has been pretty poor.
Yeah.
Very different things, but sometimes he said it's a setup, sometimes he said, these don't represent the party, sometimes it's just like, we've got rid of this person. It's not been consistent. That was the worst.
This was the worst, which was really bad.
People should go watch this, but on the homophobic one, he said it's because he got drunk and he was watching the football.
Yeah. And he said this on Loose Women as well.
Yeah. And then the lady was like, the host was like, well, I get drunk and I'm not homophobic.
Yeah.
And she said that quickly as well.
Yeah.
Like she was sharp on that.
Yeah.
I think it's something that is, there's lots of things to worry about, I think, in politics, but Farage's approach is particularly worrying, I think, because he's obviously spent a lot of time with Donald Trump and in America. He's a big Trump fan, but he's really injected some quite American and Trump adjacent things into this election, which is basically trying to undermine the credibility of the election. So he's claimed that, my list isn't going to be exhaustive here, but he's claimed Ofcom, the BBC, Channel 4, Google, the Daily Mail. These are all things that he's accused of election interference.
Election interference?
Yeah,
or just bias?
he's used the word election interference for all of these things, which is quite a big charge. And he's also casting doubt on postal voting as well.
Yeah, I saw
which
that.
is a very American thing. And I think it brings this quite, we're quite fortunate in this country that we generally do agree on the integrity of our elections. And he's injected this sort of doubt into the system, which I think is possibly quite a damaging thing.
But I also think that actually it is damaging in a way. But I think it's just an electoral mistake, because I think, and this happens with Liz Truss a lot as well, is that right-leaning figures in the UK are obsessed with America and the Republicans and their electoral success there. And they keep on importing American ideas and tactics to the UK. I mean, Liz Truss is constantly talking up about just like weird American things like the deep state and Marxism. And that has no purchase in British political discourse. And again, we should resist all attempts at American cultural hegemony, obviously. But I think I'm always quite satisfied to see that like that sort of election interference stuff just doesn't get purchased in the UK. I know he's saying, and it is a risk when it's injected into the system, but I think it's quite satisfying that we just don't have the appetite for that. That we are a very different country and electorate to the US, and I like the fact that those things just don't work over here. I think Ukraine, by the way, is a similar thing. I think that is probably in his head partly inspired by the Trump stuff.
Yeah,
the whole Trump, that NATO is bad and that we asked for it and we're going to do a ceasefire in day one or whatever. But again, it's just this if it ignores this disconnect between the American and British publics. The American public for years has been isolationist, and there's always been that isolationist streak in it since literally the 1800s. And we're not like that. We like our Churchills. We like our sort of like sense of importance in the world, and the fact that we can still do stuff on battlefields. And so I think this speaks to that larger issue, which is A, that we're just not very different, and B, we're just very different from the Americans, and B, right-wing politicians keep on seeming to forget this. You saw this a little bit, by the way, with there's some abortion chatter from parts of the Tory right a while ago, and it was a very big issue in the US. And it just doesn't have the same. It's not an electoral issue in the same way. But yeah, what was the original point?
We're so far away from it.
It was good. I agree.
Okay,
I think we're in
great.
agreement, is what I'm getting at here.
Oh, just the everything's come
support.
together to be negative for reform at the minute.
The one saving grace for reform, though, is obviously that postal voting has already started, and reforms votes are generally older, and therefore probably more inclined to postal voting.
Yeah.
And so, even if some of those stories, as they pick up traction in the final week of the campaign, it might not make much of a difference because the postal votes will started flowing in.
So winners and losers of the week?
Go on then, let's do it.
I think just on the back of that chat, I think the loser's got to be Farage.
I agree. I think that's to be Farage, yeah.
The winner is a more open question, I think. I mean, Starmer would be the obvious, wouldn't it? He's probably
I don't know,
the winner
it's sort of
every
just
week.
a by default thing, isn't it? I don't think he's done anything this week that sort of...
No, I think he didn't mess up at the debate, and he gave them quite a good speech a couple of days ago, the Don't Forget speech, where he listed all the things that you shouldn't forget about that the Tories have messed up. I think it could be Nigel Farage. Is there anyone else who's had a good time?
I honestly can't. I mean, Ed Davey, it's just it's the classics from the last couple of weeks, really. Ed Davey seems to be doing okay. He's keeping this, again, I don't agree with this argument, but I know you two do. This sort of good feeling, what a goofy guy, let's vote for Ed Davey sort of thing going on. And he's kept that going with his bungee jump today.
Yeah.
Obviously, anyone know what issue he was raising awareness for there?
I think the actual jump itself was to inspire people to do stuff they haven't done before. In this case, vote for Lib Dem.
Of course, all these big issues he's highlighting here. Ed Davey doing that. And
overcome your anxiety. It's speaking to the mental health crisis in this country.
Well, is it fuck? And then, so him, we could say him or Starmer, I think, but I can't think of any other party leader that's done particularly well.
Are there any Tory MPs that we think, prospective leadership candidates, for instance, who we think are looking well placed to benefit from the inevitable disaster?
I think I think Badenoch, if I had to put one, I would put her just in the sense that I think in the last few weeks, the Reform candidate isn't standing in her seat. She's almost certainly going to win it. And at the minute, I think it was the New Statesman this morning, had a very good line, which was, it's not so much which Conservatives will retain their seats and what that'll mean for voting, it's what it'll mean for people actually standing. I mean, that's the situation we're in.
I think
Badenoch, the fact that she will retain her seat, puts her a lot better odds of leading the party, because there's a load of other Tory leadership contenders like Penny Mordaunt, who very plausibly could lose their seat this week, and that will exclude them from the leadership race, obviously.
I think Badenoch is a good one. I think she's kept the powder dry throughout the race. You know, she's kept sort of a presence in the headlines, like doing that David Tennant argument. You saw that? It was reported very favourably in the right-wing press. It was all about her pushing back at David Tennant, telling her to shut up. But she hasn't been associated with all of the various failures of the sort of 14 years of Tory rule. And I think she's exceptionally well. I put pretty good money on her winning the leadership election. I think she's a fresh face. There's at least a perception in the membership and donor base that she's well placed to squeeze out Farage. Yeah, I think she'll. And she's insanely popular with the membership. She's reliably their most popular.
I think she's the best place to be leader.
Yeah. So I think we'll put Kemi Badenoch on there. Then, yeah. Nice.
It's a low bar to cross, really.
Well, I can't just do Starmer.
Yes, the one Tory that might keep her seat.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that is everything. Thank you very much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed the podcast, obviously. And once again, not just because I'm contractually obliged to stay, I genuinely do believe it, and I want the money. Please do consider buying the magazine. We'll have some promotional photos to show you and videos coming out in the next couple of weeks. But it really does, credit to Jan, who's behind the cameras, it really does look, it's spectacularly brilliant. I mean, it's better than The Economist. Cancel The Economist, subscribe to us.
Also, worth pointing out that we'll be doing another podcast this week.
Yes, we will. That as well. That's worth pointing out. We will do another podcast on.
It's going to come out on Thursday. On election day.
On election day. So make sure you're back here on election
predictions,
day.
What to look out for, all that sort of shenanigans.
Have breakfast, go vote, watch our podcast.
And then there obviously will be the live stream. There's also a live stream at the end of it. God, fucking, I feel like the rest is
only
politics.
for premium magazine subscribers, though.
Only for
so make sure you get
subscribers. Yeah. And use the code Bite the Ballot for £2 off.
Thanks, Jan.
That'll be in the thing down there because it was too late. We should have done that earlier.
Cool. Nice. Done.